On September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck at a Prove Me Wrong event in Utah, and soon after died from his wounds, jolting a nation already spiraling out of control. As soon as the news broke that Kirk had been shot, prominent conservative commentators and social media influencers, as well as Republican politicians, including the president and vice president, instantly concluded the assassin was motivated by left-wing ideology, even specifying that it was likely a trans person, and immediately blamed the usual suspects: the entire Democratic Party, the so-called mainstream or liberal media, and pretty much the entire left. Some even called for civil war and the dismantling of the Democratic Party, all before authorities had even released any information about the suspected assassin, let alone before anyone was in custody. Tyler Robinson, the alleged assassin, was captured about 33 hours later. This series of events has put enormous pressure on long-standing cracks in American society, cracks which, sadly, it feels are reaching a breaking point. On this episode of I Have a Theory About That, I argue that Charlie Kirk was a fascist propagandist, and I can prove it. Let's go through a few definitions of fascism, and ultimately I'm going to synthesize them and provide my own, because I really think there's one core feature that kind of entails all the others. So first we have the dictionary definition. Let's start with that. Here it says fascism is a populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. Now, one of these, the person right here, Jason Stanley, is actually a very well-known scholar of fascism. He says, at the core of fascism is loyalty to tribe, ethnic identity, religion, tradition, or in a word, nation. And I generally agree with that, but you'll see that my definition, I think I get to even more of the core, so to speak. Here we have a definition from the Council on Foreign Relations, which describes extreme nationalism, a cult of personality, which is something that the dictionary definition, I think, left out. It talked about a dictator, but it didn't really get into the specifics of that. I think cult of personality is also very important. And then it talks about this thing, or it talks about popular mobilization, where they're basically saying that they are anti-democratic, but they at the same time they mobilize a certain, let's say, favored group to get into politics and to get into basically the movement and essentially assist the government in suppressing the unfavored groups, so to speak. So here it says, on the other hand, fascist regimes seek to energize public participation in society through government organized channels. Both Mussolini and Hitler, for instance, drew massive crowds and rallies intended to stir up enthusiasm for the country, the party, and the leader. Right? So on the one hand, you have a strong dictatorial, centralized government, but and not only that, but it is extremely oppressive to those who are disfavored in any opposition, of course. But for those who are in the favored group, let's say the Aryan group or the white Christian male group, that group then is, the government wants them to be very much involved in politics. Another very famous, really more of a checklist for fascism is Umberto Eco's, I think it's the 14 points of fascism. He talks about, number one, a cult of tradition. Number two, a rejection of modernism. Number three, the cult of action for action's sake. This is interesting. It's described sort of tied into misogyny in a sort of uber male kind of attitude. And it says, action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. So, that's a really interesting one, right? Even to think itself is pussy, and that's kind of another feature of fascism, which really harkens to this sort of male-dominated patriarchy. Disagreement is treason, right? That's often used to help suppress any kind of dissenting voices. The fear of difference, appeal to social frustration, that's a really important one that I will touch on in a minute. The obsession with a plot, right? In other words, there's always some kind of conspiracy. There's always some kind of potential danger to the regime or to the nation. Some group is always trying to destroy the nation, right? There's always kind of an emergency that needs to be addressed, especially using force. The enemy is both strong and weak. That one is really important too. You can see this in modern American politics where, Antifa is just a bunch of, pink-haired pussy high school kids who can't fight for shit, and at the same time they're a designated terrorist group that could potentially, destroy the entire nation, right? So which one is it? In a fascist regime, it's really both, and it's meant to be both, right? Because you want the good group, you want the in group to feel like they're powerful and they can win. That's why the enemy is weak. But you also want to be able to justify emergency powers and strong military presence and oppression by saying, but if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant, they could destroy us at any moment. So both weak and strong. The enemy is both weak and strong. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, right? Any kind of desire to understand or compromise is viewed as treason. Contempt for the weak, right? This idea of sort of masculinity and strength, those things are put on a pedestal. Everybody is educated to become a hero. This one's an interesting one. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. I'm not sure about that one. I don't really know that one very much. But machismo, number 12, and weaponry, right? This is the kind of, it sort of pervades some of the other ones. But this idea of machismo, which implies both the disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Selective populism. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people, right? So obviously, this is what I'm referring to as the in-group. The in-group, whatever they think is what everyone thinks, what everyone should think at least, or the only opinion that actually matters, right? That is the populism, but it's selective, right? Because you have these enemies, these internal domestic enemies whose voice not only doesn't matter, but are a threat to the nation and the government. And finally, number 14, fascism speaks newspeak, right? If anyone who read 1984 knows what that's referring to, George Orwell's 1984. Here he explains that all the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning, right? So there's a purposeful intention of trying to basically keep people stupid, right? Keep their ability to think outside the box limited. They want only those who are thinking within the box. The only acceptable paradigm is the paradigm that the state gives you and says is the right one and the true one. So all of these definitions touch on fascism, and I think they're generally good. But I think the one thing that's really missing from all these, that I'm actually a little surprised, is that to me the core of fascism is the idea that we as a nation have to return to a previous time, a golden era, an era where things were right, things were good, people were happier, were more, were wealthier, were better off, and things were pure, right? And so the idea of purity is intimately tied into this, right? And so with fascism, what you have is it usually festers, and the breeding ground for fascism is typically a disillusioned populace, a great nation that has fallen, or at least people believe it to have fallen, or to be falling, right? So you can see after World War I, Germany was a perfect breeding ground for fascism, right? This once great nation, that has had a great and long history, philosophers, great composers, major industry, invented things and did all these great things and so on and so forth. After World War I was completely destroyed, utterly, mostly destroyed. Inflation was out of control. The economy was terrible. And in addition to all that, sort of adding insult to injury, was the Treaty of Versailles, which blamed Germany for World War I and pretty much forced it to become kind of like a debtor nation to the rest of the world in perpetuity, or supposedly, or at least one could have perceived it that way. So in that milieu, so to speak, people, you could imagine people being just utterly, not only disillusioned, but just feeling like something has been ripped out of them. Especially younger people who would hear stories of this glorious past that they had. And now they look around and they're like, well, what about me? And so the idea of we have to return to this past, this glorious past, is central to fascism. And I think that, we should also note that the past that they want to return to may actually be mythical, right? At least to some degree. There may be some truth to it and there may be a lot of myth to it. And we'll come back to that in a second. Because it's not always, what they're trying to return to is not always something that actually existed. But it definitely existed, at least in their minds or in their, their parents' minds, their forefathers' minds. Or at least the fascist propagandists would have you think that, right? And so that to me is the core tenet of fascism that kind of leads to everything else. All of the other things are kind of like tentacles that attach to that core part of it. And that's why, it's obsessed with patriarchy, because the man has always been in charge, has always been, the fighter and the leader, at least, again, not necessarily in all cultures, but at least in these cultures that are susceptible to fascism, and in the specific ones that have actually existed, like in Nazi Germany. And so the idea of masculinity and of traditional values, all of these things are paramount in the fascist mindset and the fascist ideology. Now, as you can tell, let's again use Germany as an example. Clearly what happened after World War I was a major change, right? Change is putting it lightly. It was a, monumental transformation of the society. And so the point of fascism is to return to, the time before this change. In America, you can say that the change was the civil rights movement. And we're going to get to this in a second, but also the New Deal, right? So from the founding until the Civil War, you had a very, very different society than you had after the Civil War. But even from the Civil War to the New Deal, and then to the, which is in the 1930s, and then to the Civil Rights Movement, you also had a very different society. Following the New Deal, and a little bit later in the 50s and 60s, you had the Civil Rights Movement. Following that, you had a very different looking society, right? Literally different looking, in the sense of more people of color joining the ranks of those who are allowed to frequent, regular places, as opposed to blacks only and whites only. And with respect to the New Deal and the economy, you had more people competing in the economy. You had more opportunity. You had a growing middle class throughout the 50s. Many, and including myself, would attribute that largely to the New Deal, and of course to the fall of most of Western Europe after World War II. And so society changed a lot, right? So fascism generally looks at that change as something that is terrible, something that is impure, something that poisoned the original beauty and purity and wonderfulness, so to speak, of the glorious nation that has now fallen or is falling, right? So that to me is the core tenet, and everything else, like I said, sprinkles from that, right? Because in order to, well, let me step back. that is why fascism is a revolutionary ideology. It requires, immediate force in order to change things. Because the more we're loosey-goosey about it, the more these others are going to get involved and are going to continue to make these changes that we find to be horrible and to be, antithetical to our way of life. And so fascism also involves the loss of not just this culture, not just this golden era, but often the loss of power of one dominant or once dominant group. Either because they've completely fallen, or because now, especially in the American example, they have to share the pie, and they don't like sharing, right? So what you have then is really, it's not just revolutionary, it's actually counter-revolutionary. Again, using the American example, you can think of the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement as essentially a revolution, right? In that they were not necessarily violent, although there was violence, but in the sense that they fundamentally changed the society. And that is revolutionary, right? Fundamental change is generally what we consider revolutionary. And so it's sort of like the Empire Strikes Back for you Star Wars fans. The empire now of the white Christian, especially male, is fighting back against all these changes that have, led to the impurity and the falling, again, according to their point of view, of the nation. So that is what they essentially want. And so in America, and you can see where I'm going, not only is conservatism, but especially, I don't think all conservatism is necessarily fascist, but it's certainly fascist adjacent, right? At least if you use my definition, right? Because it wants to, I guess the way it could not necessarily be fascist is, if you look at conservatism in the old sense of the word, where it's like, okay, we're willing to change things, but not fast, right? Not fundamentally, and at least not when you have to change it by destroying everything and rebuilding from scratch. In that sense, no, okay, that's not necessarily fascist. But once things have changed to a certain degree where it has become so different from what a certain, especially privileged class wants it to be, and what they believe is the right way for things to be, and these new institutions are built, right? Because remember, the irony is that conservatism usually likes institutions, wants to keep institutions, doesn't want to change things too much, if at all, right? But if there's been a revolution that has ultimately created new institutions, and it's gotten to the point where a certain powerful group of people don't like those institutions because it is too much of a fundamental change from when they believed the world was a better place or the nation was a better place, suddenly they become very different from your typical conservatives, because now they do want to destroy institutions. They want to resurrect the old institutions, and they want to destroy the new institutions, the ones that came about via this revolution that they're now countering, right? So that to me kind of explains why everything else happens, why there is like I said before, why there's an obsession with patriarchy and traditional values, why racism and xenophobia, especially, as well as homophobia, as well as misogyny, are basically integral to fascism, because that's how things mostly have been, especially in the West, and including the United States, without a doubt, right? So if it's always been, and if in the golden era, men were the ones who, were in charge, and women had to stay home and clean the house, take care of the kids, and they didn't work, well, then that must be the formula for a golden age. So we got to go back to that, right? You see the logic. So all of these other things, we can go back to, the selective populism too, right? The selective populism that we were talking about with Umberto Eco makes sense because we want only the group that was originally in charge to once again be in charge. The idea of this domestic enemy, well, you have to blame somebody for the fall. It can't be you, right? That would not make any sense, right? So you have to blame some kind of, either foreigners, which makes a lot of sense, right? We used to be a great nation, and our nation and our blood was pure up until these foreigners came and destroyed it all and started breeding with some of our own folk and creating these darker colored children, So it all makes sense, right? In Germany, it was a lot of different groups, but especially the Jews, right? The Jews were the ones who were responsible for whatever it was that led Germany to fall to where it was post World War I, right? In America, it's clearly the immigrants, as well as in some cases to some people the Jews, but more blacks, women, gays, and immigrants, right? These are LGBT more broadly. These are the targeted groups because prior to the civil rights movement, they either didn't exist, right? At least not in public, or they knew their place, right? And so that is what they are trying to reverse. The fact that these people, these outer groups, these non-original people, are now in places of power, at least becoming more so. Still got a ways to go. But they are against all of that. What we might consider progress, they consider destruction of all that was good and holy and wonderful from before. So that to me is the core of fascism. And we all know that Charlie Kirk was a Trump supporter. He was a supporter of MAGA. He was a MAGA spokesperson. I mean, even really before MAGA took off, he was already kind of out there in the early to mid 2000 teens, basically trying to argue that this country has fallen down the tubes because of affirmative action, which was a outgrowth of the civil rights movement, and the influx of immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, and women getting all uppity, feminism and leftism, right? So you can see both the attack on the civil rights movement as well as the attack on the New Deal, less so, but I think people like Charlie Kirk would say that the New Deal and the things that came about due to the New Deal are essentially socialism, communism, and that's always bad, and that's always wrong, and that's why we are where we are. So now I'm going to prove to you that Charlie Kirk was not only a fascist, but a propagandist. And let me just quickly define propagandist: someone who uses misleading rhetoric to try to convince people of something, some sort of political idea or larger ideology. So here's a clip from Charlie Kirk that is actually from PragerU. And I remember the reason why this caught my attention is because someone that I know, that I really respect and consider an incredibly intelligent and someone of fine moral character. He was actually a military vet. He was an expert in cases that I worked on as an attorney, and I respect him. I like him. I've known for a while that he's far right, or let's just say he's conservative, and he was a Trump supporter. And I was shocked to see him. I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was kind of shocked to see him post this and be like, I forget exactly what he said, but something like, this man knows his stuff, and I was like, okay, let's see. And when I watched it, I was just like, I can't believe that this kind of shit passes for intellectual and, not only accurate, but like brilliant. So let's take a quick look.
Our country was founded on common law because the Declaration only refers to God 4 times in the Constitution. It doesn't refer to God at all. And it only articulates the structure of government.
So first of all, remember that we were a collection of states and colonies, and you need to read the state constitutions before anything else. 9 out of 13 of the original states required you to be a Bible-believing Christian to serve in government at the time of the founding. All 13 out of 13 required a declaration of faith. 9 out of 13 required you to be a Protestant, except Maryland, which was Catholic, which still required a declaration of faith. Almost every single one of the...
All right, so let's stop right there. So let's talk about the state constitutions. He's right that 9 out of 13 required a declaration of faith, or at least specifically that one must be Protestant in order to be in the government. first of all, let's just comment the fact that it's 9 out of 13, so not even all of them. Okay, but the majority, fair enough. What he leaves out is the most important thing, right? So we have these state constitutions. What about the Constitution? What about the United States Constitution? You know, the thing that the founding fathers wrote. Right now, some of them did have some involvement in writing the state constitutions. I'm not going to deny that. But if you look at the federal United States Constitution, you'll see here in Article 6, Clause 3, Oaths of Office, it says, the senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. In other words, the 13 or 9 out of the 13 state constitutions may have had a religious test or may have required that someone be a Christian in order to serve in government. But the United States Constitution, the one that we really care about, explicitly rejected that. So this notion that you have to look at the 13 states and only 9 out of 13, first of all, but fine, the 9 out of the 13 all require that, it doesn't matter. Those same people, or at least some of those same people who were involved in those state constitutions, when they gathered together in Philadelphia in 1787 to formulate the United States Constitution, they explicitly did the exact opposite. So that's why Charlie Kirk is misdirecting your attention to something that doesn't matter or matters much less. And he completely ignores the fact that the Constitution itself explicitly says the opposite of the thing that he's trying to dangle in front of you to confuse you and mislead you. All right? So that's number one, an absolute, total misleading. At best, we'll call it misleading. We might as well just call it what it is, which is utter bullshit.
The original state constitutions, Pennsylvania included, they had, I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior in the original state constitutions.
So that also doesn't matter, right? Because ultimately the U.S. Constitution doesn't have you say that, right? Clearly that was rejected. That was not what the founding fathers thought that the federal government should have you do, even if that is the case. And I think it's not even the case for every single state constitution.
Remember, we're a collection of states before that. Secondly, 55 out of 56 of the original signers of the Declaration were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians. So common law.
Really? I don't know about that. First of all, 55 out of 56, where does he get that number? Who was the last one? Who was the 56th? I don't know. But that is also not true. All right. Number one, we know for a fact that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were not your typical Christians, so to speak. All right. Thomas Jefferson, let me put it like this. What Christian do you know would rewrite the Bible and leave out all the miracles and all the citations or all the statements about the divinity of Jesus? What Christian would do that? Right? Isn't the most important, or at least the fundamental belief in Christianity, John 3:16, that God so loved the earth that he gave his only begotten son to die for your sin, etc. Well, if you're a Christian, why would you leave that part out? Why would you leave the part about being divine, about coming from God, out? Right? And there are quotes by Thomas Jefferson where he says that he's a Christian, but he means it in the way as someone who follows the teachings of Jesus Christ. Some people might know this phrase of or this term of being a red letter Christian, because in a certain time period, I'm not sure exactly when, there were Bibles, and probably today, there were Bibles that had every time Jesus spoke, it was written in red font to distinguish it from the rest, the commentary, so to speak. So he was a red letter Christian, so to speak. But more importantly, he did not himself, when he rewrote the Bible, did not include any parts about Jesus' divinity. Even more spectacularly, we have Ben Franklin, who specifically said that he doubts Jesus' divinity. He's quoted as saying exactly that. In a letter to Ezra Stiles, Benjamin Franklin says that he admired Jesus' morality while being, quote, doubtful as to his divinity. What Christian is doubtful as to Jesus' divinity? So that's at least two. So he's at least off by one, right? Because we at least got 54 out of 56 right there, right? But, you know, neither of them were regularly attended church. George Washington apparently was a bit more of a churchgoer, but some sources argue that he did it more in the sense of trying to keep up appearances. He was a politician. You know, obviously he was a general first, but he eventually became a politician, became the president. And it was more of an appearance thing. It wasn't so much a, as far as we know, a deep conviction and adoration for the religion of Christianity. You know, there's a quote by him that's saying that religion and morality are indispensable supports a Republican government. But at the same time, he also wrote a letter to the Jewish Americans at Newport, I think it was Newport, Rhode Island's Hebrew congregation, explicitly saying that there is equal liberty to all religions in the United States. So you can't say that it was some sort of exclusive club of only Christians when the very first president of the United States specifically told a Jewish congregation that liberty was equal to all religions. All right. Now, my favorite founding father is Thomas Paine. He was not at the Constitutional Convention. He, to me, is a founding father. Some people might dispute that, but there's no doubt that his writings had a major influence on the founding fathers. And he was a contemporary, right? He, in many ways, inspired the American Revolution. Many people say that Common Sense and I think it's called an American Crisis, but it might also be called Notes on an American Crisis. Either way, his works were read out loud by George Washington to troops during the Revolutionary War to help inspire them in battle. And he was clearly a deist. He, not only do we know that for a fact, that he wrote it. He wrote a book called The Age of Reason, which explicitly argued that Christianity, as well as Judaism and Islam, are false in the sense that they cannot truly be the Word of God. And he argued against belief in any what he called revealed religions, right? Religions that claim to be revealed from God himself. So there's absolutely no evidence that 55 out of 56 of the founding fathers, whether you're talking specifically about the people that were at the Constitutional Convention or more broadly like Thomas Paine and people like that. In fact, deism, which is this belief that there is a God, but he doesn't reveal himself, he doesn't have prophets, he doesn't send down his son or anything like that. It's more like he created the universe, including the earth and the human race, and then he kind of just went away. And the rest of what's left for us to understand about this universe is through science. That is the essential deist and Enlightenment philosophy and view. It's not every Enlightenment philosopher saw it that way, but many did. And deism was kind of like this middle ground position between Christianity or religion in general, divinity, and atheism. A lot of people still were a little scared to call themselves atheists, unlike, well, some people like Voltaire did, but most of them were kind of like in this middle ground. And many of the founding fathers are considered to be deists, not Christian, or Christian in name only, like Thomas Jefferson, when they really didn't believe in Jesus' divinity. So that is a completely false statement.
So common law is inherited from Blackstone, who was Christian.
So right off the bat, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The common law wasn't inherited from Blackstone. Blackstone wrote the ultimate treatise. First, there was a guy named Edward Coke who wrote this treatise on the common law, which is the English law, essentially. And then about 50 to 100 years later, Blackstone wrote what is considered the ultimate treatise on the common law. It didn't come from him. The common law was a tradition from centuries, even before Blackstone and Coke, which were writing in about this. Coke was in the late 1600s. Blackstone was in the early to mid 1700s. So this idea, so he just straight up doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, right? They were commentators about the common law. They didn't create it.
The common law is an outgrowth of the scriptures. So let's go.
That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Okay? The common law is not an outgrowth of the scriptures. It is a series of judicial opinions that essentially state the law, right? And that this goes back to Magna Carta. And Magna Carta was in 1215, and that was essentially when a group of knights told the king, I forget which king it was at the time in England, that we're not taking your shit anymore. Okay, we need, essentially due process and habeas corpus, and these ideas that are now institutional to our law were essentially set forth in the document called Magna Carta, which was basically saying, look, if you want us to still support you and not, go to war against you, you better listen to these things, which was the sort of first statement of like the rule of law, at least in the West.
Let's go to three principles of common law: presumption of innocence, due process, and jury of your peers. All three are biblical principles, wrapped into the ultimate biblical principle that you shall not favor justice if you are rich or poor, which is in Leviticus 19, right before the most famous part of Leviticus 19, which is that you should love your neighbor as yourself. But before that is that in the administration of justice, you shall not favor the rich or the poor, which is the idea of blind justice. We get that in the West, which is incorporated also in the New Testament ideal: neither slave nor Greek nor Jew, you're all one in Jesus Christ, which we get the idea of human equality. These are all biblical ideas. They're not Enlightenment ideas, which is they kind of get conflated at the time.
Once again, he's saying the opposite of the truth. Now, you can always, and Muslims, scholars do this, Jewish people, rabbis as well, and Christian people, that you can easily find things that are said in these books and say, oh, that's where we get this, or at least that's the same thing as this. So that's what he's doing. So yeah, you could say that, and you could say that those statements that he quoted are similar to some of these principles, but the common law, and specifically those ideas of due process, which really is the umbrella term that includes presumption of innocence and trial by jury of your peers, those things were slightly pre-Enlightenment, but they were refined and explained or promoted in their greatest form during the Enlightenment. And Montesquieu is one of his book, The Spirit of the Law, The Spirit of the Laws, is one of the main statements of these principles, right? Now, it doesn't mean that he invented it necessarily, but the idea that these came from the Bible is nonsense. The majority of the Enlightenment movement, and again, going back to my favorite founding father, Thomas Paine, the majority of their argument was against what is called the divine right of kings. And the divine right of kings was the explicitly Christian argument using the Bible that tried to justify monarchy and kings specifically by saying that they were descendant from Adam. So really what you have is a clash between the ideas that ended up becoming the founding principles of the United States, which came from people who were fighting against the idea of the divine right of kings. That was directly sourced from the Bible, whereas the backlash was, you could argue, against the Bible, or at least against one version of an interpretation of the Bible.
But more importantly than that, they say that God was only mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's a big deal, okay?
God was mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the word God, I think, only once was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, and that was nature's God. The other times God was mentioned was other synonyms for God, like providence, the creator. Sometimes, I'm not sure if it was in the direct Declaration of Independence, but a lot of the founding fathers would say things like the author of the universe. These things are not Christian. How many times, just anyone who's watching this, if you're a Christian, how many times have you heard your pastor or your priest call or refer to God as nature's God or the creator of the universe? That one maybe a little bit more, but or providence. These words were explicitly deist. They are not and were not Christian terms. They were ways of describing God that actually specifically were meant to distinguish this God from the Christian God, right? And notice how he doesn't say the Declaration of Independence specifically mentioned Jesus, or the Declaration of Independence specifically mentioned the Bible, or specifically mentioned Yahweh, or Jehovah, or the God of the Bible. None of it, because it's not there.
Okay, laws of nature and nature's God. The last paragraph of the Declaration.
So he just said it, right? Laws of nature and nature's God. Nature's God. Does that sound like a Christian God to you? No, that is explicitly deist, a deist God.
Reads as a prayer. It says, we appeal to the supreme judge of the universe. Who's the judge of the universe? Jesus Christ, as it says in Revelation.
Once again, the supreme judge of the universe. This is like, he's just trying so hard to kind of, put the square peg into the round hole. The irony is that the supreme judge of the universe, again, is a deist formulation for God, as opposed to, and why not just come out and say, this is something that lay people might not understand, might not know, but in legal interpretation of things, if you mean something, then you just go ahead and say it, right? So if you meant the Trinity, you meant God, you meant Yahweh, you meant Jesus's Father, so to speak, you would just say it. You would just say Jesus. You would just say the Bible. You would just say Christianity. But that is nowhere found in the Declaration of Independence.
That Jesus will judge the earth on his throne. So in the Declaration, they were praying to Christ our Lord as a prayer very specifically. Thirdly, as I said on stage yesterday, Deuteronomy was by far the most quoted book, religious or non-religious, in the time of the founding when they were putting together the Constitution. More than John Locke, more than Montesquieu, more than Blackstone. So the book of Deuteronomy, which talked about laws, customs, traditions, it was Moses' farewell address as he's about to say goodbye, say, hey, good luck in Canaan, guys. Here's how you should set up your form of government. But
I wondered about this. I thought to myself, I was like, where did he get this? Like, I know it's not true, right? It can't be true. But I looked into it, and I think I found the academic paper, the research paper that he was referring to. And I believe he was referring to this paper by a man named Lutz from, I think it was the 80s or the 70s. And what Lutz was trying to do was he wanted to understand the ideological influences of the founding fathers, right? And so he did a survey of all the literature, essentially, of that time, and even earlier. I think he went from like the 1750s or 60s all the way through the 1805, 1810s. And what he tried to do was to show, what was out there, what were the broad influences of the founding fathers. Now, you might say, okay, well, if it turns out that the Deuteronomy was one of the most well-known and cited works, well, then clearly it had an influence on the founding fathers. And I don't disagree with that. So yeah, here from 1760s to 1805. I don't disagree with that. But it's very misleading what he said. He made it sound as if the Deuteronomy is something that the founding fathers themselves were citing in their own works. That is absolutely not true. There is no mention of Jesus, God, the Bible, Deuteronomy in the Federalist Papers. There's no mention of Jesus, God, or the Bible in the Anti-Federalist Papers, except for I found in one speech during the convention, so not even technically the Anti-Federalist or the Federalist Papers, there was mention of Israel, ancient Israel, and certain stories about, I believe it was Solomon, and they were using it as an example. But there were also references to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and other historic cities, civilizations, religions, and people. So the idea that this is somehow prominent or prevalent throughout the founding fathers' own words is absolutely false. The only thing that this proves is that Deuteronomy was a thing that people were talking about at the time, which no one disputes. The founding fathers themselves did not cite Deuteronomy at all when it came to their own explanations of what they believed the Constitution meant what it was for, how it was developed, how it was structured, anything of the sort.
Finally, and most importantly, let's look at actually what the founders said. John Adams famously said the Constitution was only written for a moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate for the people of any other. The body politic of America was so Christian and was so Protestant that our form and structure of government was built for the people that believed in Christ our Lord.
First of all, notice that he only mentioned one founding father, okay? Notice that the founding father that he mentioned in the quote was John Adams, who did not even say in the very quote that he cited anything about God or anything about Christianity. It said religion generally and morality generally. So even his own evidence doesn't support his argument. Not only that, as I already mentioned, there are other founding fathers from Jefferson to Franklin to Paine who explicitly said things that were contrary to basic Christian doctrine. Madison is an interesting study. I looked into him a little bit more. He also was very much in favor of the separation of church and state. He and Jefferson fought very hard to make sure that there was no reference to any religion except the idea that you are not allowed to use religion as a test for public office. And we know that James Madison is essentially the main author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution, but came after the original Constitution, and that he and Jefferson were adamant that there was no specific religion associated with the government of the United States. And so this idea that you could quote one founding father who doesn't even mention Christianity, as if that proves that this is a Christian nation, as if we're what did he say? We're basically founded on Christian morals and that this is a nation for Christianity, is an utter embarrassment to intellectual thinking whatsoever. Our form and structure of government was built for people who believe in Jesus Christ. Once again, go back to George Washington's letter to the Jews. He specifically said that the Constitution in the country that we just created, that he was the president of at the time, was providing liberty to all. Now, we know that it wasn't exactly true, right? Because it wasn't providing liberty to black people or Native Americans or really women or even poor people. But essentially, when it came to religion, it was not, and explicitly not just for Christians. And just to give you, this is beyond just Charlie Kirk, but here we have PragerU using the dollar and the statement "In God We Trust" on the dollar as if to sort of give further credence to this notion that it's a religious and Christian nation. First of all, God is not just exclusive to Christianity, but more importantly, the "In God We Trust" on paper money did not appear until the 1950s. It was originally on coin money in the 1860s during the Civil War, which nonetheless, even though it's a lot earlier than the 1950s, is not when the founding fathers were alive. Okay, so this idea that this whole thing, this entire video, is clearly propaganda meant to make people who don't look into things carefully and are already predisposed to believing this, believe that this is a Christian nation exclusive of other religions and other people of other beliefs, like atheists.
One of the reasons we're living through a constitutional crisis is that we no longer have a Christian nation, but we have a Christian form of government, and they're incompatible. So you cannot have liberty if you do not have a Christian population.
And there it is. That is how you can now tie it all together. Not only was he lying about pretty much every single thing he said, but now you see why he's lying, right? So the lying and the misleading and, the sort of using a small nugget of truth to kind of bury it into a bunch of bullshit, that's the propaganda part. But the last thing he said shows the fascist part. Because what he's saying is, if we don't have a Christian nation, right? The original, the people who were here during the Golden Era, who were in charge during the Golden Era, if we don't have that, then we don't have liberty. If we don't return to this time when only Christians were allowed to be in office, which is never really the case, at least when the United States government or as far as the United States government is concerned, as opposed to the state governments. By the way, most of those parts of the state constitutions have been amended since. Some were somewhat recently, most in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. So even those state constitutions no longer say what they said about having to be a Christian. And I think the one or two that still do say that, it's kind of ignored. Right? So he is literally saying that in order for this country to be, to not have a constitutional crisis, in order for this disillusionment that we seem to feel this day and time, in order for that to go away, we need to have a Christian nation, and that the nation has to be made up of mainly Christians. To me, that fits perfectly with the definition of fascism, because it is fascism.